Hello, I'm Dave.
And I'm Rob.
And welcome to the Doctor Who spin-off show, The List Makers, episode 38, Top 5 Space Stories. Rob, you ready for this one?
Dave, I've been ready all month, and I'm curious how we're going to tackle the topic.
Yes, me too. There were a number of ways we could do it.
Yes.
Do you think we'll snap?
I do think we'll snap, yes.
I reckon we'll get a couple. I reckon that one and that one. I've put little bits of marker on my piece of paper, so...
Yes, listeners, I have no idea what he's talking about when he says that one and that one because we don't use video.
No, that's right. So look, it's my turn to go first, so I will dive in.
Okay.
Top 5 space stories. Number 5, The Wheel in Space. Mm-hmm. I decided, Rob, that I was going to find stories that were both great stories, but stories that were at their core about space. Mm-hmm. And The Wheel in Space not only has space in the title, and I will admit I was tempted for a few crazy moments just to do stories with space in the title. But The Wheel in Space is about being in space. It's actually one of the few Doctor Who stories that's really about what it's like to live in space, how that works for humans, what their environment's like, what the pressures are like. And it is about that sense of mankind, of humanity, just thrusting forward into space, those early steps, those early space stations. So, as well as a good adventure with the Cybermen introducing Zoe, this is a story all about what humanity's first steps out past our solar system would be like, and I think it's a really cool space story.
For sure.
Number 4, I've gone The Impossible Planet. When you think of stories about space, this is one where space is almost a character. The vistas of the space station, it's called a space station, the vistas of that space station are all about those wonderful views of space. They are trapped inside that base because outside is that deadly space. They escape through space. The planet is kept in check by a phenomenon in space. They're at the edge of space. This is again about humanity out there in space. Space is all around. And it's also a bloody good story. One of my top 2 or 3 of the Tennant era. Do I have to say now the first Tennant era?
I think so, yeah.
Well, whatever it is, it's a great story. Continuing along with stories from the Tennant era, I have gone at number 3, The Waters of Mars. This is not a perfect story. It's got a few literally problematic moments, shall we say, but at its heart is again a great adventure that again is all about space. It is about us going beyond the moon to Mars, those first colonies, about the bravery of people that get out there and explore space and are the first to colonize places like Mars. Again, the environment, that space environment, is so much of the visual of the story. It's so much of the setting of the story. They can't escape because of space. Some of the most memorable shots of it are the Doctor walking through the atmosphere of Mars, looking out into space. It's all about that, and I think it's a great story, and it's all about space.
Yes.
Continuing the space theme, number 2, The Seeds of Death. This story is at its heart, at its absolute fundamental first principles, about space. And it's all about that transition in technology from rockets to TMAT and then back again afterwards. It's set in space, it's set on a lunar colony. It's all about how we start to interact with, again, those really early journeys of us as a species into space. It talks about space sickness. It talks about airlocks. The Doctor spends a whole episode in space in a rocket with Jamie and Zoe. There are few stories that are more about space than The Seeds of Death. But the one that is, number 1, Frontier in Space. This was the first one I went to. Again, it has space in the title. It's an obvious one. But again, this doesn't exist if the story was not about space. It's about 2 great empires thrusting forward into space. It's all about travel through space. We start with hyperspace. We start with cargo. We set up empires in space. There are so many different spaceships that travel through space. The Doctor goes on a spacewalk. The Doctor almost suffocates in space. Everything about this is about space. It's also a wonderful, wonderful, exciting space opera. Yes, I went there. A space opera story. You cannot get more spacey than this, I contend, which is why it's number 1 on my list. I have some honourable mentions, but I've said my list was very obvious and there's nothing better. So now we'll find out if you've got exactly the same list Or you disagreed and you found even more obvious ones, Rob?
Dave, for a moment, I thought, is this going to be a night where we just snap on everything? But in the end, it was only two snaps.
Okay, was it the two I thought it might be? Let's find out, Rob. Time to make your list.
Okay, Dave. In at number 5, I've got State of Decay. And I'm starting with a slight cheat here because they're in E-space. But we didn't agree on what kind of space it would be, did we?
No, we never set these things up. We just each take the topic and go.
That's it. I've always had a soft spot for this story on a number of levels. I mean, I like vampire stories. I like the tone of season 18. I like Doctor Who stories that are quality, yet no one seems to really rate them. And when was the last time you heard someone gush about State of Decay? I mean, honestly, this ticks all those boxes and more, and it's a rare example of Terrance Dicks writing a TV story to boot. I think it's good stuff.
Fantastic.
In at number 4, I have The Ark in Space. Maybe an obvious one here, but the space theme is just so strong. We're on an ark in space. I can't go past getting it in here. And something that blows me away about this one, Dave, whenever I stop and remember it, is this is only Tom's second story. While I never forget that it's from his first season, of course I always remember that, I sometimes forget it's only his second story. And he's just so Tom, he's so doctorish in it. It's kind of wild to think about the performance. He's not groping around in the dark trying to find it. He's the Doctor. And this is a great story, so job done.
Nice.
In at number 3, I have Earthshock. A bit of a stretch here, as the whole story isn't really set in space, but a good stretch of it is on the freighter, and the big conclusion and the death of Adric happens there, so it feels spacey enough for me to have on the list. And while it's sure the one where Adric dies, in quotation marks to modern audiences, the return of the Cybermen here can't be underplayed. It had been, 7 years since they were last on the show? A modern audience doesn't think about that or feel that when they see it. You know, they just pull out the disc and put it on and there it is. But for the time, their appearance and that new look was just amazing. So that goes here at number 3. In at number 2, The Waters of Mars.
Hey.
From the point of view that, yes, the humans working on the base in this story, they're from Earth, and Mars is out there in space, so this is a space story. I know it's a story I've pulled up in the past as having that weird idea where people are turning into what seem to be ice warriors with scaly mouths and stuff, but they don't have anything to do with ice warriors, even though they're on the ice warriors' home planet. I still think that is so weird, Dave. But overall, the story, the themes, the ending, all of this is really good, and I can't not rate it, so there it is.
The other one must also be a snap?
Yes, Dave, I've got The Impossible Planet and the Satan Pit. This has to be my number 1, as it's one of the great stories of the Tennant years. It's fairly simple in terms of the story and what goes on, but I think it's just executed so brilliantly. And in terms of the space theme, I mean, as you were mentioning, yes, it's out on a little base in deep space on a planet orbiting a bloody black hole. I mean, does it get any more space than that? To me, this is very much a modern take on the Hinchcliffe era, and I can't give it higher praise than that. It's a shame more New Who isn't actually like this. Maybe not every week, but more often at least. So that is a definite number 1 for mine.
Well, yeah, we had our 2 snaps there. I definitely thought we'd get The Waters of Mars. I thought you'd do Frontier in Space.
I thought you'd do Ark in Space.
Yeah, no, really, really interesting picks. Now, one of my runners-up was Colony in Space. That was really fighting until the last moment with Wheel in Space for that last slot. Again, it's about actually exploring, but I just felt there was a bit more about how they're living in actual space in the Wheel in Space. So I went for it. Now, if we had done a top 5 stories that have the word space in the title,
yes,
we've mentioned most of them, but we haven't mentioned the Space Museum.
True.
The Space Pirates. Or Spearhead from Space.
Yeah, that's really true. And look, with a couple of those there, and maybe even similar to Wheel in Space, they're in my head, and I thought, but these are top stories. And it's always an interpretation. Is it my top stories? Is it what fans think are the top stories? And when it comes to Wheel in Space, for example, that was one I considered. And I like Wheel in Space considerably more than the average fan. But is it a top story to me? I couldn't quite justify it. And it would be the same with a couple of those stories. So they didn't make my list. But yeah, they're in consideration, don't you worry.
And of course, if we're doing episode titles, the first part of the Sensorites,
Here we go.
Strangers in Space.
Of course.
Look, Ark in Space is a really good pick there. I do really like it. And it's funny, as I was just going through my mind and thinking, what are these really spacey stories? The Ark in Space didn't pop up because it's so indoors. It's
right.
so in that set. But of course, it is in a space station. It's all about the Wirrn coming through space and mankind surviving in space. So, yeah, I think that's a really, really obvious one that I perhaps missed.
And a place we go back to later in the season. It's an important sort of place, yeah.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. Do you think that the space genre is one of the best genres for Doctor Who to tackle?
I do. And, do you know, although we've been rattling off names left and right, they aren't a huge drop in the bucket of Doctor Who overall. Did you sort of find that? Because I actually got out my lists. I went to policebox.net, which is my little website where I've got lists of all the Doctor's stories. And I'm actually looking through them and thinking, what's particularly spacey? And a lot of stories really aren't. I mean, there are some others that we haven't mentioned, maybe like Oxygen from the Capaldi era, out in space and all about not having oxygen when you're in space.
Yeah,
but,
The Invisible Enemy is another one.
Yeah. Do you agree that there aren't a huge number, relatively, for like a sci-fi show, you know, the TARDIS's time and relative dimension in space, all of this stuff, and yet there are a lot of stories that aren't really spacey?
Yeah, no, I think that's something that I found as well. When this topic first came out of the hat and I was sort of driving to work the next morning and thinking, what are some space stories? There are so many. And then, like you, I was sort of like, oh, hang on, I better look and find some more because this isn't actually as easy as I thought it would be. And I wonder how much of that is because space is really hard to do and probably a bit expensive to do.
Well, you think of something like Kill the Moon, and that looks amazing, but they had to go to Lanzarote for that to get the look of the moon's surface and such. Think of something like Terror of the Vervoids. It's very 80s, very...
cheap.
I was thinking of a kind word there, Dave, but you beat me to it. Yeah, it is hard, yes.
Yeah.
You think of Davo and the cricket ball in Fort of Doomsday, and that's just a terrible effect. Space is hard to do.
Yeah, and the moment you go into space, you need spaceships, you need space suits, you probably need guns, you need communicators, you need computer banks.
Yeah.
It all becomes just a little bit difficult, a little bit terrible. And spacesuits especially are just terrible, whether it's film, TV, even with a budget. Spacesuits always look terrible because a proper spacesuit is a big, sort of baggy, big helmety, like they're serious bits of kit. They're not just sort of, you know, scuba costumes in space. They're serious bits of hardware, and they do fog up.
They do. And also when we think of how, not just in the 60s, but even through to the 80s, you know, you tell a designer, design a spacesuit from the future, and they always go in weird Flash Gordon sort of directions that just look terrible.
Rob, do you think there's a difference in the way Classic Who and New Who approach space stories?
Well, I'm immediately thinking of costumes because I was just mentioning costumes, and I'm thinking in the modern era, that orange sort of spacesuit that several doctors have worn, it must be kicking around in the TARDIS wardrobe. And that looks way better than interpretations that we would have had of spacesuits back in the classic era. I mentioned going to Lanzarote for Kill the Moon. That made the moon's surface look amazing. Oxygen, I know you don't particularly like that story, but I think it's very scary, the thought of being up in space without oxygen. I think it does space a hell of a lot better, yes.
I think that, yes, budget and effects are a very obvious difference there, but there's almost a difference pre and post moon landing, or that sort of moon Gemini sort of era versus later. You think about a lot of these 60 ones that we've mentioned, stuff like Wheel in Space, Space Pirates, Seeds of Death, and those stories really contain a sense of wonder about space and a sense of achievement about getting to space, but also this real, not fear of space, but just understanding of how hard it is to get there. And I think that when you're living with the space program going on, you have that. And of course, famously, stuff like the Space Pirates, the Ambassadors of Death, another one we haven't mentioned, which has the British space program.
Yeah.
Those are stories where the production team had said, right, well, it needs to take time to get between different places in space, and things are a bit slow and things are a bit majestic and a bit balletic, because that's what people are watching on TV. You know, the rocket doesn't take off from Earth and arrive at the moon in 20 minutes. It's sort of like, well, day 1, day 2, day 3. Okay, now we can watch them land on the moon, and now day 4, day 5. So there is that sort of sense, whereas anybody who's, under 50 has probably never seen a lunar mission.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And also, for some reason, it popped into my head that in the early 70s, you would have had stuff like 2001: A Space Odyssey, and that sort of very, very slow take on space, almost a very realistic take on space, very silent, really.
Yeah.
And by the end of the 70s, you're in Star Wars, with X-Wing fighters flying about and sound and, explosions and stuff. And it's almost completely the opposite vibe. I don't know why that popped into my head, but I'll just throw it out there while I think of it.
Yeah, no, I think those are really good markers in the way that we portrayed space in science fiction generally. And again, Star Wars basically comes at the end of the lunar program.
Yeah.
So maybe there is a bit of a connect there. But either way, I think that we've just put together a list, and with all the other ones we've mentioned as well, just really, really good stories. And I love it when Doctor Who goes into space. I think it's just so cool. And space is just such a cool word.
It is. And another one I thought you might have picked just for the Adric element, Earthshock. Yeah,
again, it's an interesting one where you mentioned it. I'm like, of course, this is a space story. Of course it is. But when I think about it in my mind's eye,
yes.
It's all corridors and caves.
Yeah.
So maybe that's why I didn't go there. But yeah, no, I mean, look, it's a classic story. I love it, and yeah, I get why it's on your list.
Anyway, we're running out of time. What if we?
We are running out of time.
Next time, Dave, have you got your hat there?
I have got my hat. Next time we have from listener Suicidal Chicken.
Hello, Suicidal Chicken.
Top 5 non-Doctor Who monsters and races you'd like to see in the show.
Oh, blimey. Okay.
That's a different one. Thank you, Mr. Chicken.
That's, yes. As always, my mind starts making the list automatically, but I've got a month to think about it, but, yeah.
We've got a month to think about it. We've got 4 hot takes in a monthly show coming up in between that and then.
Oh,
but,
gosh, yes.
Yeah, non-Doctor Who monsters and races in Doctor Who. I'm sort of looking over my shoulder at my DVD shelf and thinking already, but we'll talk about that next time. Until then, I've been Dave.
I've been Rob.
And we'll speak again soon.
Bye-bye.